All right, hello, welcome back, part two. So last video we talked a little bit about Freud, his iceberg theory, and some of the defense mechanisms. So I just want to continue on talking a little bit about some of the other influential psychologists within the study of personality. Sorry, I just yawned in the video. My bad. So here we go. All right, so we do want to talk a little bit about the Neo-Freudians. So the Neo-Freudians, they agreed with Freud on the big idea about the unconscious. So they did agree, yes, like our childhood has shaped us, our past experiences have shaped us, and we do have this unconscious. We do have these unconscious desires and drives, and each of these are different for all of us. But they didn't always agree on the emphasis of childhood sexuality. Again, we are going to derive the psychodynamic school of psychology as an offshoot. But they also had some theories of their own. So the first one I want to make sure we know is Carl Jung. So Carl Jung, which is spelled Jung, was a Neo-Freudian, and his sorry, I just had like weird editing things happening. His basic idea was the collective unconscious. So he did agree with Freud's idea of the personal unconscious. We each have these kind of unique unconscious desires, but he also thought that we have a collective unconscious. So this is like something that we inherit from our common ancestors as human beings. So like all humans have this collective unconscious that also influences our behavior. So Carl Jung looked at archetypes, and he looked at like analyzing common themes in dreams and just in general. He talked about the persona. So this is the part of our personality that we share with the world, and then our shadow. And the shadow is like the darker part that we hide from the world and we hide from our conscious self. So for men, he said they have the anima, and for women, they have the animus. So for the anima, this is like for men, they hide the tenderness and compassion and emotional part, because those are traits typically associated with women according to this, collective unconscious. And then for women, we might hide the aggressive, rational, logical, whatever, things that would typically be like masculine traits. So this is just kind of interesting to look at. If you look at any archetyping and Jungian archetypes, they're really fascinating to study. So I encourage you to look into that. The next Neo-Freudian we want to talk about is Alfred Adler. And Adler came up with the idea of the inferiority complex. So Adler's inferiority complex theory said that we all basically, on some level, feel inferior. Like we're constantly feeling like we're not good enough or comparing ourselves to other people. And that causes us stress, and that causes us issues that may manifest in other ways in our life. Adler said that this inferiority complex develops when we're children, because we're constantly surrounded by adults and people that are bigger than us and more capable than us. And as we grow up, we kind of become obsessed with these feelings of inferiority, and we're constantly striving for power and recognition in order to kind of compensate for this inferiority complex. So this is I find this theory very interesting, because it has us, compensating in other ways of our lives, and this may come out. It's something that's unconscious, but it may come out in our behavior or, things that we do. The next person I want to talk about is Karen Horney. All right, I'm just going to stop here because I just wanted to make sure I was saying this right. And here we go.
Names.com. Horny.
But then there's also the German pronunciation.
Horny.
So there you go. All right, so Karen Horney was a proponent. She disagreed with Freud. I'm sorry, an opponent. She disagreed with Freud. So the biggest thing is that she really thought that Freud's theory was pretty sexist. She didn't necessarily agree with how he portrayed like the idea of penis envy. And she talked about something called womb envy. So that men actually have womb envy, that they actually feel the effects of, psychologically, they feel the effects of not being able to bear a child and not being able to have the biological function of bearing a child. So that was kind of interesting. But she did stress that the focus really should be on parent-child relationships, and that we need to feel secure in this relationship, and that our behavior is really derived and driven from this parent-child relationship. And the parent impact on personality is huge. So yeah, so she was a critic of Freud. She said women are not inferior to men, and she did talk about womb envy. All right, so I want to go back to Freud. We did talk about the iceberg theory, and we talked about defense mechanisms, but I do want to talk about how Freud thought that the personality develops, because he did talk about us as children going through stages. So his stages were psychosexual development. And so this is where the ids, pleasure-seeking energies, focus on a specific area of the body, and there is specific steps in development. So we're just going to get over the names of these stages and be mature. We have the oral, the anal, the phallic, the latency, and the genital stage. So oral is ages 0 to 1, and the center of life, or the pleasure-seeking energy, is centered on the mouth. This is where we get the name oral. It's not sexual in the way that you might think about it. This is 0 to 1-year-olds, okay? This is the idea that the main things that are going on with this are sucking, biting, and chewing. So if you look at like babies and very small children, you give them anything, they're going to put it in their mouth. Okay, that's exactly what they do. Like, you have to be careful. Anything that you give them, they just put it in their mouth. The anal stage, ages 2 to 3, is focused on toilet training. So they're centered on bowel and bladder waste and coping with the demands of learning how to use the toilet and all of that. In the phallic stage, ages 4 to 5, the zone is in the genitals. So this is where they cope maybe with that Oedipus complex for boys, both girls and boys, they will really love the parent of the opposite sex. So like boys will love their moms and girls will love their dads, daddy's girl, whatever. And they might disagree with and butt heads with the parent of the same sex. But at the same time, they're learning from the parent of the same sex, and they're learning to model the behavior of that parent of the same sex. So that's kind of interesting, is they're grasping with this. And then the other part of this is like, yes, they will, like, they'll touch themselves, like not in a sexual way, just like because they're learning their bodies or whatever. So a lot of people are like, oh, is this because like you see little kids like touching themselves? They're not touching themselves in a sexually inappropriate way. Like, that's just something that they do at that age, and you just have to teach them like not to do that. So yeah. And then the latency stage, ages 6 to 12. So this is like that school age, when we're talking about school age for Piaget's development and cognition. The latency stage is like that school age. So this is where sexual feelings are dormant. You're not really focused on like reproduction or anything in that age. You're really focused on like school and just learning how to like socially interact with your peers. And then once you hit puberty, then you have the maturation of sexual interest. So one thing that we want to talk about with psychosexual development in Freud is Freud talked about something called fixation. This has nothing to do with the fixation that we talked about in like our problem solving and cognition unit, where we talked about functional fixedness and not being able to solve a problem because you can't think divergently and all of that. This is a different fixation. So this is fixation that goes with the Freudian psychosexual development. So fixation, according to Freud, is the lingering focus of pleasure-seeking energies at one of the early psychosexual stages where there are unresolved conflicts that result in problems later on in life. So like, this is an example. Freud claimed that smokers, gum chewers, thumb suckers, and nail biters were all fixated or experiencing fixation in the oral stage because of some sort of conflict during the oral stage that went unresolved. So it doesn't have to be conflict related to, oral stimulation or thumb sucking or whatever. It's any sort of conflict or trauma or unconscious problems that happened during that time period of their life that can result in fixation of behavior that goes with that time period. So let me show you some examples. Okay, so if you're fixated in the oral stage, you might see people biting on pens, you might see people thumb sucking, biting their nails, eating a lot, all of these things. It's not because they had a problem like with their mouth when they were babies. It's because something would happen in that stage that caused that fixation. So some sort of psychological trauma. Maybe there was not attachment, infant attachment, secure attachment, like an Ainsworth thing. Or, maybe there was, whatever. There was some sort of psychological trauma. In the anal stage, you might say, like, if someone had experienced fixation because of trauma during the anal stage, they may become quote unquote anal retentive. So this is someone who's like obsessively neat organized. They don't necessarily have OCD. They just like things a certain way and they become very obsessed with that. Or anal expulsive. This is like a non-conforming sloppy person that like, has no system of organization and I don't know, just looking at this picture makes me stressed out. So this is kind of interesting to look at. The phallic stage, like I was talking about before, this is where boys and girls go through that modeling of the same gender sex, but also like the infatuation with the parent of the opposite sex. So they have two different ways of talking about this. The Oedipus complex is for boys who are resentful and jealous and competitive of the father because they want their mother's affection and love. And then we have the Electra complex, which is the female version. So female is daddy's girl, they want the attention of their father. Freud said this is when penis envy develops. So when girls realize that boys have a penis and they don't, they may feel, literally they may feel of penis envy, but also like the bigger picture of this is that like girls just in general feel less powerful throughout their lives because they don't have a penis and, they struggle with the fact that they don't have this and whatever. So this is where I was just talking about Karen Horney's theory on womb envy. This is the reason why that came up is because Karen Horney said, well, Freud's theory is incredibly sexist and doesn't really look at the whole picture, whereas, men may even have womb envy as opposed to women having penis envy. So that's just something to think about. So here's the identification. Okay, one thing that can happen with fixation, according to Freud in the phallic stage, is narcissism for men. If men become fixated in the phallic stage, they can become incredibly narcissistic. We can see the development of narcissistic personality disorder. And women can suffer from the inferiority complex, which Adler said, like, we all suffer from, but Freud specifically said this was something for women that happened with fixation in the phallic stage. For latency, again, those school years age, there is that sublimation. So the sexual impulses are redirected into learning tasks and, things that are not sexual, because this is a time period where reproduction's not possible and all of that. Freud said a person who is fixated in latency would become very frigid, cold, kind of removed from emotion or removed from social life. So that's kind of, I don't know. And then someone who is fixated in the genital stage, are not fixated, but they've had past fixations, may have problems in the genital stage because of those past fixations, maintaining and having healthy relationships. So, obviously part of the genital stage is those intimate relationships. That's kind of the goal, with the ultimate goal, according to evolutionary psychologists, being like reproduction. But for the psychoanalysis, they talked about how you might have trouble having intimate, healthy relationships if you've had past fixation. So it's kind of interesting. So in order to deal with fixation, or even to deal with any of those defense mechanisms we talked about in the last video, there are different methods, and we're going to do more in our clinical psychology unit, but there are different methods that you can use within psychoanalytic psychology. So hypnosis is one. Dream analysis is another, but also we have the technique of free association, which is kind of like a stream of consciousness technique, or you can use a Rorschach inkblot, or like a thematic apperception test, where you're basically trying to get people to tell you what do they see, what comes to mind, and get people talking and telling a story that you can then analyze and figure out, why are they saying this or why are they saying that, and ask them questions even where they can explain what they've said, what they've seen, and then you can analyze that, and you can really just get a lot out of that conversation. There are other techniques. We talk about Freudian slips, where people say something that they say is a mistake, but it actually reveals maybe like their true feelings about it. Transference is something that can happen when we talked about this with defense mechanisms, but you put your feeling, you can actually like project intentionally onto your therapist and kind of role play and try to pretend that they are a person, or tell that person how you feel, using projection or even using role play. So that's kind of cool. So we'll talk more about this stuff later on. Yeah. Okay. We did this. Awesome. All right. So I'm going to stop this video here, and I'll do a third video where we talk about, all right, well, if we have all these ideas about what makes our personality, according to Freud and some of these other psychologists, how then can we actually look into our personality traits and figure out like what our personality is, or how can we analyze our personality? So I'm going to do a third video where I talk about some of those tests or some of those inventories that we can use.